Well, last week in our sermon of series on the story of the Bible, we talked about the book of Judges. And Judges was a real low point in the history of Israel. It was a time in which there was no central authority. There was no political leadership, no central political figure who could unite all of the different tribes of Israel into one common group. And there was also no moral authority. There were no figures who could inspire everyone to follow the same path. No accountability to make sure that people were really doing what God wanted. Instead, the key line is that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And as we saw, when we do what's right in our own eyes, it tends to skew towards what works out well for us and for the people in our tribe. People who we see look like us, who talk like us, who share our beliefs. Rarely are folks willing to stick their necks out for someone who is different from another community, another place, another ideology. And we really saw this play out in Judges. You might recall in particular when we were in Judges chapters 10 through 12 that we heard a story about the tribes that had settled to the east of the Jordan River, which are Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh, collectively called Gilead. And they were being attacked by the Ammonites. And they reached out to their sisters and brothers on the other side of the Jordan River and said, hey, we need help. But the help didn't come. And they deeply resented them for it. This created a literal barrier between the two halves of the land of Israel. They fortified the Jordan River, and they said that people weren't even allowed to come on their side of the land or else they would kill them, essentially rejecting them as fellow Israelites and treating them as enemies. Well, the book of Judges goes on, and these patterns continue. And after a brief respite in the book of Ruth, we find ourselves still in the same situation in 1 Samuel. Remember, 1 Samuel starts off in the era of the Judges. Samuel himself was a judge, and we find that these patterns and cycles are still going on. In fact, once again, the tribes of Gilead were being attacked by the Ammonites. But in this case, by a king who was even more cruel than his predecessors, named King Nahash. Now, King Nahash not only wanted to conquer different towns and regions in the land of Gilead, he not only wanted to make them pay tribute and offer loyalty to him as their overlord, but he wanted to dominate and humiliate them. And so he would threaten to gouge out the right eye of every man who lived in each of these communities so that they would know who was boss and they would learn to fear him. And the people of Gilead were terrified. They didn't know how to respond to this. And so they were so desperate for help that they swallowed their pride and they reached across the Jordan one more time to see if anyone in the other side of Israel would be willing to come over and help them. But this time, someone did. There was a man named Saul from the tribe of Benjamin who heard about how terribly his fellow Israelites were being treated. And he was so enraged by this that he broke a yoke, made this dramatic symbolic action, and inspired people from all throughout the land of Israel to come together in a kind of campaign which went across the Jordan River and fought back the Ammonites so that finally the people of Gilead were liberated. And this was a moment of healing for the nation. The people of Gilead felt like a wrong had been righted, that the people on the other side were finally caring about them. And for the people in the other side of Israel who had just been humiliated and suffering from defeats, this was a great victory, a sign that maybe the times were changing. And so they were so excited that they decided they wanted to come together as a united nation, and they wanted to make Saul the king of that nation. So they find the most religiously respected figure in the entire land, and that, once again, was Samuel. And he offers sacrifices to God and begins a ceremony in which Saul is crowned as the first king of Israel in the name of the God Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. Now, this is a transformative moment in the story of the Bible. It launches what is called the period of the United Monarchy. And for many people, both in the Bible and all the way up to the modern day, this is seen as a kind of golden age of Israel, a time when the people of Israel got it right, when they were living exactly in the kind of way that God wanted them to live. And they were blessed and prosperous and successful for it. And it's really crucial how we understand this, how we interpret this part of the story. Because among other things, it has a big implication on how we understand Christians' role in relation to government and world issues in the world today. Because for many centuries, millennia, in fact, there have been Christians who have looked at these stories about Saul and David and Solomon and seen them as a model for how Christians were supposed to engage in the world. Now, okay, they acknowledge that it wasn't flawless, right? Shortly after Saul has this great start to his reign, he falls out of favor with God. So God ends up raising up another person, David, to be the king of Israel instead. But nevertheless, they were doing it right in general, weren't they? I mean, they were united as a people. They had worship of the one God as the one state religion. And they were prosperous. They were independent. They were successful, and especially in relation to their battles and conflicts with the other nations and peoples of the world. And so the majority tradition of Christianity has looked back at this and said, this must be what God wants for the world, right? This is how we ought to model ourselves after this kingdom that we see in Israel. We ought to try to seek out godly leaders, godly rulers, and be willing to defend them with the sword if necessary, to have these strong, powerful states that can protect their leadership, and then to use this kind of powerful apparatus to enforce the worship of the one true God, or at least to make it a God-fearing society in which we can all live. However, there has also been a minority tradition within Christianity throughout its entire history that has questioned whether this is the right understanding of how Christians are supposed to relate to government, or more broadly, how the people of God are supposed to relate to government. And they're not just bringing up practical political concerns, although those certainly come out. People wondering whether it makes sense to bring church and state together, or whether a separation of church and state is healthy. But there's also a questioning of whether we're actually reading the biblical story correctly. Because these Christians, including the early Anabaptists, made the point that there is a thread within all of these stories about the kingship and the rule to ask questions about whether this really was God's ideal for humanity. And that actually begins with Samuel himself. Now, Samuel, of course, is the figure who makes this particular merging of church and state possible. He's the only religious figure who was well respected enough throughout the land of Israel that he could anoint a king and say that this is God's will, and the people would believe it. It had legitimacy when Samuel declared it. But before Samuel does this ceremony in which he makes Saul king, a few chapters earlier, he's wrestling with this concept because people are coming up to him before he even knew who Saul was and saying, we need a king, all right? This whole situation with judges, it's just not working out. It's a mess. We're fighting each other. People are doing whatever they want. We need to have a king. And Samuel hears them. I mean, he knows that the situation with the judges is not going well. But his instincts as a prophet of God tell him that this doesn't seem right to me. When God called Sarah and Abraham and the people who emerged out of Egypt to be a set-apart nation, a kingdom of priests, a holy people, I don't know if this idea of having another monarchy is really what they had in mind. But he wasn't sure. He was kind of agonizing over it. So appropriately, he comes to God in prayer. And this is what God says in response to Samuel. He says, "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you." Oh, okay. So the people are requesting a king. I guess God is on board with this monarchy thing, right? Listen to the voice of the people and all that they say to you. But God goes on, "For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." Now, hang on a second. Rejected me from being king. What's that supposed to mean anyway, right? Like, how is this a rejection of God? I don't remember God ever saying that he wanted to be their king. The people are still worshiping God. They're trying to make God superior to the king. I mean, this whole ceremony in which Saul is anointed as a servant of God is meant to reinforce that he's under God. So why would God be frustrated by this, right? It's not like there has ever been a time in Israel's history when there weren't leaders who kind of facilitated God's rule. What makes this a kind of rejection? What kind of political arrangement did God have in mind if it wasn't something like a monarchy? Well, we don't get much from God here. We don't really get much of an answer to that question in particular about what alternative God might have in mind. But we can find from the following interaction between Samuel and the people some evidence about why God didn't think that this was a great idea, and indeed may have even perceived it as a rejection. So first, God sends Samuel back to talk to the people, and he's open to what they're saying. Samuel is not planning on forbidding them from having a monarchy, but he does raise several points of just what are inherent problems involved with the monarchy. And some of those include, I'm sorry, I have a little technical difficulty on my end here. Some of those include conscription, right? So you might remember from the reading that Frank gave us that the people were told that they would be forced to serve in the military of the king. They might be forced in a number of different roles, or at least forced to support it financially. But if you're going to be a part of a monarchy, then you're signing up to be involved in the wars of that monarchy. Another point that he makes is that they are going to have to pay taxes. They're going to be under a rule of taxation, and that can be very burdensome for people at times, but this is part of the deal. And then also makes a point that what I might call class differentiation, where the people are told that they are going to have to give the best of their wealth to the king and the king's fellow folks who say they need it in order to run the empire. And as a result, it'll create this kind of distinction between the rich and the powerful and the poor. It goes on to use language as dramatic as slavery, saying that they will become the slaves of the king. But, you know, as he's going through and saying all this stuff, the people couldn't even listen to these points that they were making because they were so frustrated with Samuel. They were so eager to have this king. So instead, the text goes on to say this. But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, "No, but we are determined to have a king over us, so that we also may be like other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. Now, I think here we get some insight into why God may have perceived their response as a rejection, right? It's not just that God doesn't think that this is a good idea, but this is a rejection. And I want to start by highlighting one part of this response, the comment at the end that they desire to have a king who would fight their battles. Now, this is a perfectly understandable thing that the people would have wanted, right? I mean, after all, the Israelites were surrounded by enemies on every side. There were the Ammonites, the Amalekites, the Philistines, the Moabites, the Edomites, and on and on and on. All of these folks who were frustrated with the Israelites and who would take any opportunity to conquer or even kill them. Now, as a side point, we might ask whether this would have been such a violent situation had they not entered so violently into Canaan in the first place. But let's put that aside, because whether or not that was the why, the reality is that they were in a situation where they were threatened by enemies on all sides. And it makes sense that they wanted to have a structure that made them feel safe, right? Not to just be in a situation where they had to hope that a leader would rise up who would be able to rally enough people to defend them, but they had a king they could look to for guidance, who had a plan, who had a military behind them, and who better than Saul? The only problem with this is that God had been promising them all the way since Exodus that he would be their protector. God said, you don't need to rely on military power or human strength. I will do it. And this actually goes all the way back to Exodus, from the time when they're under the rule of the most powerful monarch in the world at the time, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And there is not a single human being who does anything to fight for their liberation. Everything that happens comes from the result of God, who first issues the plagues and then carries them through the Red Sea. And then at the end, after bringing them through the Red Sea, tells them this: listen, the Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still. Actually, he said this before taking them through the Red Sea, right? So I got to correct that, because God wanted the people to learn to trust not in the military strength of a group like Pharaoh with all of its chariots, but to trust in God. And this trust is manifested in story after story ever since. God promises to save them from starvation by sending them manna. God gives them the wisdom and the guidance they need to be able to have to find their way through a disorienting desert. God protects them from various types of enemies through miraculous feats whenever the time comes. But still, they were not willing to put all of their faith in God, right? They felt like, it's just foolish to just trust God blindly. You need to have some kind of a military force around you. You need to have a plan. And this has been the argument for Christians defending violent institutions ever since. Of course, one thing that people point to is reality, the realpolitik, what's going on in the world around us, So you can't just have these ideals and blind hopes that things will work out. And in Israel's case, they pointed out that, look, we don't want to be like the other nations, right? Let's just be like the other nations. But, God wasn't just expecting them to blindly hope for redemption. There were other ways that they could trust God for their defense, alternative ways to defend themselves without an army. And as it so happens, the book of 1 Samuel gives us several examples of this, even as the rest of the nation goes in the direction of surrounding itself with military force. For example, first you have the example of Abigail. This is a story in which David and his troops at this time had been offended by a man named Nabal, who rejected hospitality for them. And David was planning on going in there and killing all the men in that place. But Nabal's wife, Abigail, even though she herself had done nothing wrong, she wasn't involved whatsoever in this offense, she went out and apologized for her husband, appealed to David's greater conscience, and was able to protect the people of that land as a result of this action. She's praised as a peacemaker in this story. Now, admittedly, you can't always just appeal to the good senses of your adversaries. And sometimes you have to be a little bit more forceful in confronting those who are doing wrong. And we have an example of this too in Jonathan, right? So Saul, at a certain point in the story, becomes completely determined that he just wants to kill David, even though there's absolutely no justification for it. And Jonathan, his son, confronts him about it, sticks his neck out to confront him about David. Now, this doesn't immediately sway Saul. At times, it has an effect on him. But David has the support of a community of people who are his allies, of people who are willing to hide him, of people who are willing to advocate for him. And this served as an alternative kind of defense. And then sometimes you just have to come up with creative responses, right? Sometimes people use symbolism or kind of the honor-shame system in order to pressure folks into doing good. We have an example of this when David is fleeing from Saul and actually has an opportunity to kill him. But instead of killing him, he cuts off a piece of his cloak and shows it to him and says, "Look, I could have killed you, but I didn't. Now, may the Lord be the one to avenge me if you kill me after this." And guess what? It worked. Without shedding a drop of blood, David was able to resolve to bring peace to this extremely tense and violent conflict. Now we see individuals showing throughout this story that God can still work in ways that are outside the box. But for the community as a whole, there was just too much risk involved. This requires creativity and faith and risk, and you don't know if it's going to work. And so, as we saw from their response, what they wanted to do was to say, no, let's just be like the other nations. That's what's tried and true. That's the direction in which we ought to go. Now, finally, I want to highlight one more response that they offered in this speech. And it's a response in which it seems to be appropriate for them to ask for someone to govern them at first. But if you look a little more closely, it says, no, we're determined to have a king over us, that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. That's a significant line. They wanted someone to go out before them. They wanted somebody who would inspire them, who they could actually see and identify. This person is our leader. This is the one in whom we trust. And there's a deep human yearning for that, to have people that we can look to as kind of our guides in these types of situations. The problem is, when we do this, we tend to idolize those individuals. We put them on a pedestal. Our moral judgment again gets skewed so that we tend to paper over their faults and over-exaggerate their strengths. We're only able to see God's will through the lens of these particular individuals, and it's hard for us to hear the valid things that God is telling us through other people at the same time. In fact, God makes the connection between idolatry and this kind of leadership in his initial response to Samuel. He says, listen to the voice of the people and all they say to you. They've not rejected you, but me as king. Just as they have done to me from the day I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. It's a kind of idolatry. It's a need to find some kind of tangible human support that we can put our faith in. which is comforting, but it's not a comfort that the people of God are supposed to have. We are always called to return directly to God by faith. Now, this is hard, right? This is a high calling. And so you can understand why the people of Israel didn't want to do it. But what's interesting about this story is that God accommodates. God recognizes that they're not at a point where they can have this level, this degree of faith. And so God allows them to have a king, even though it isn't the ideal. And God doesn't just allow them to have a king, but God actively works within this imperfect institution to make the best out of it. That's why we see when Saul begins acting in his own name instead of looking to God, an act that could exacerbate the problem of idolizing Saul, then God calls up another leader, and David, to take the mantle on instead. And I think all of this has significant implications for how we understand our role in the world in the 21st century as we're thinking about the governments, the nation states around us. I think it's important for us to recognize that even though they're not kingdoms with literal monarchs for the most part, the same principles apply. They're still nations that want to conscript us, or at least get us involved directly or indirectly in the wars that they fight. They still use that same justification as you need someone to fight your battles. They still point to all of the other nations of the world as setting the standards for what's reasonable and expected, and we still have a tendency to idolize our leaders to a fault, to the point that it causes major divisions between those who idolize one figure and those who idolize another. Now, if God was willing to work within the context of the imperfect system of Israel, then I think that it's also true that God is willing to work within the context of the political systems of our day. And we should. We should do the best, make the best that we can out of them while still being faithful to God. But as the people of God, and not just members of this or that nation state, I think it's important for us to retain a different political imagination. To remember that our protection doesn't really come from these states, that our protection comes from God, that our options are not really limited to what people say are the only practical options out there. But God can do things that we could neither ask for nor imagine without the Spirit's help. And so the question that I want us to be asking is, what would it mean to be ruled directly by God? What did God envision for the chosen people when calling them to be set apart as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation? What did that mean? We should be asking this question as we read through the rest of the stories of these kings and looking to see if there is anyone in this biblical story who will show us even a better way to live together as God's people